They didn't notice it at first. No loud moves, no desperate need to prove anything, no performance for approval. Just you, unchanged, unbothered, and painfully real in a world that survives on masks. And that's what unsettled them. Because when someone refuses to bend, it quietly exposes everyone who already did. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. Your consistency wasn't boring, it was rare. While they were busy adjusting themselves to fit in, you stayed aligned with something deeper, and that made them uncomfortable in ways they couldn't explain. Not because you attacked them, but because your presence held up a mirror they weren't ready to look into. Authenticity is unsettling because it doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't adjust itself to make others comfortable, and it doesn't dilute its edges just to fit into a room full of expectations. Most people survive by wearing carefully constructed versions of themselves, shaped by fear, approval, and the quiet pressure to belong. They learn early which parts of themselves are acceptable and which ones need to be hidden, softened, or completely erased. Over time, the mask becomes so familiar that they forget it was ever a choice. Then someone like you walks in, not louder, not more aggressive, just real. And that's where the tension begins, because authenticity doesn't attack directly, it reflects. It stands there without apology, and in doing so, it forces others to confront the gap between who they are and who they pretend to be. That gap is uncomfortable. It's easier to criticize the person who refuses to play along than to question the role you've been performing your entire life. They'll say you're too much, or maybe not enough. Too quiet, too different, too detached. But those labels aren't really about you. They're a defense mechanism. When people see someone living without the same fear that controls them, it disrupts the fragile balance they've built. It challenges the unspoken agreement that everyone should just keep pretending so no one has to face the truth. Authenticity doesn't follow the script, and that's what makes it dangerous in their eyes. It doesn't seek validation, which means it can't be controlled through approval or rejection. You're not reacting the way they expect, not chasing the same things, not bending under the same pressures. And when someone can't predict you, they can't place you. When they can't place you, they feel threatened, so they try to shrink you down to something they can understand. They question your intentions, they twist your silence into arrogance, they interpret your self-respect as distance. It's not because you've done anything wrong, but because your existence disrupts their narrative. If you can live honestly without collapsing, then what does that say about the compromises they've made? The truth is, authenticity removes the safety of illusion. It exposes how much of life is built on performance, and most people aren't ready to admit that. They've invested too much into maintaining their image, into playing roles that earn them acceptance, even if it costs them their identity. Seeing someone reject that system without falling apart feels like a threat to everything they've justified. You become a reminder of what they abandoned, not loudly, not intentionally, but just by being consistent, by not switching faces depending on the audience, by not reshaping yourself every time the room changes. That kind of steadiness is rare, and rare things tend to attract attention, curiosity, and eventually resistance. Because deep down, it's not hatred, It's recognition mixed with discomfort. They see something every you that they buried in themselves, something they convinced themselves wasn't practical or safe, and instead of reclaiming it, they push back against you. It's easier to label authenticity as a flaw than to admit it's something they lost along the way. Silence makes people uneasy because it leaves space for interpretation, and most minds rush to fill that space with their own fears. Words are predictable. They give others something to grab onto, something to measure, respond to, or twist if they need to. But silence offers nothing to hold, nothing to control, and that lack of control creates tension. When you don't explain yourself, don't defend every action, don't react on cue. It disrupts the rhythm people rely on to feel secure around you. Most conversations aren't really about communication. They're about reassurance. People speak to confirm their place, to test how they're being perceived, to make sure they're still understood and accepted. When you remove your side of that exchange, when you choose stillness over constant expression, it forces them to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of exposing what they'd rather keep hidden. Your silence becomes a mirror, reflecting their assumptions back at them. If they feel insecure, they'll assume your quietness is judgment. If they feel guilty, they'll imagine you've noticed something they hoped would go unseen. If they're used to controlling narratives, they'll interpret your lack of response as resistance. None of it comes from you, but all of it gets projected onto you, because you didn't provide a script for them to follow. There's a certain power in not reacting, in not rushing to fill every gap with explanations or emotions. It shifts the balance without making a sound. People expect reactions because reactions make things predictable. Anger can be managed, excitement can be matched, even disagreement can be negotiated. But calm silence doesn't give them an entry point. It leaves them facing themselves, and that's where discomfort begins to grow. They start watching you more closely, trying to decode what isn't being said. Every small action becomes significant because they don't have your words to guide them. They analyze your expressions, your timing, your absence of response. The less you reveal, the more they project. And the more they project, the more they expose their own inner state without realizing it. Silence also removes the opportunity for others to manipulate your narrative. When you don't over-explain, there's less material to distort. When you don't react emotionally, there's less leverage to use against you. It creates a boundary that isn't announced, but is clearly felt. People who rely on reactions to maintain control find that boundary frustrating because it limits their influence. At the same time, your quietness challenges the expectation that everything needs to be externalized. In a world where people constantly broadcast their thoughts, their struggles, their validation, choosing silence can feel almost unnatural to those who depend on noise to feel seen. It raises questions they don't want to ask themselves about why they need to be heard so often, about what they're avoiding when they keep talking. What unsettles them most is that your silence doesn't look like suppression. It looks intentional. It carries a sense of awareness, as if you've already processed what they're still trying to figure out loud. That contrast creates a subtle imbalance. They're searching for clarity through expression, while you've found it in restraint. And restraint, when it's genuine, doesn't seek attention, which makes it even harder to understand from the outside. Without saying a word, you change the dynamic of every interaction. You slow things down, you remove the predictable cues, you make people confront the spaces they usually fill with noise. And in those spaces, what they've been avoiding starts to surface. Not because you forced it, but because your silence left no place for it to hide. Consistency doesn't look impressive at first. It doesn't demand attention, doesn't create sudden spikes of excitement, doesn't give people a dramatic moment to react to. It's quiet, repetitive, almost easy to overlook. But that's exactly why it becomes powerful over time. While everyone else is chasing intensity, reacting to every shift in mood, adjusting themselves depending on who's watching, consistency stays steady. It doesn't need validation to keep moving, and it doesn't collapse under pressure because it was never built on emotion alone. Most people operate in bursts. They start strong, fueled by motivation, recognition, or the desire to prove something. But when that fuel fades, so does their effort. They rely on feelings to carry them forward, and feelings are unpredictable. One moment they're driven, the next they're distracted, discouraged, or pulled in another direction. That cycle creates noise, movement without direction, effort without stability. Consistency doesn't follow that pattern. It's built on discipline, not impulse. It shows up whether it feels convenient or not, whether anyone is paying attention or not. And that's where the quiet separation begins. While others are waiting for the right moment, the right mood, the right approval, consistency keeps building, piece by piece, unnoticed but undeniable. At first, people don't take it seriously. They assume it's temporary, just another phase that will fade like everything else. They've seen too many people start and stop, too many promises that never turned into something real. So they project that same pattern onto you, expecting the same outcome. But when you don't break the pattern, when you keep showing up in the same way, with the same focus, without needing to announce it, their perception starts to shift. Consistency creates a kind of pressure without saying a word. It forces others to confront their own inconsistency. Not directly, not aggressively, but through contrast. Your steady movement highlights their instability. Your quiet discipline makes their excuses more visible. And that's uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that progress is complicated or out of reach. It shows that the real barrier was never ability, but commitment. There's also something difficult to control about consistency. It doesn't react to external noise. Praise doesn't speed it up. Criticism doesn't slow it down. It operates on its own terms, which makes it unpredictable in a different way. Not chaotic, but unshakable. People can't manipulate it, because it isn't driven by their opinions. It doesn't need approval to continue, and it doesn't depend on recognition to feel justified. Over time, what once looked small starts to accumulate. The quiet efforts, the repeated actions, the discipline that no one noticed in the beginning, all begin to form something solid, and that's when people start to pay attention. Not because you suddenly became louder, but because the results can't be ignored anymore. What was once dismissed as insignificant now carries weight. That shift creates a different kind of reaction. Some will respect it, even if they don't fully understand it. Others will feel threatened by it, because it exposes the gap between intention and action. They'll question how you maintained it, how you didn't lose focus, how you didn't get pulled into the same patterns that stop everyone else. And the answer won't be dramatic or complicated. It will be simple, almost frustratingly so. Consistency removes the need for constant explanation. It speaks through repetition, through presence, through results that build quietly in the background. It doesn't rush to prove itself, and it doesn't need to announce progress. It just continues, steady and deliberate, while everything around it fluctuates and fades. Your truth doesn't need to be loud to be disruptive. It doesn't arrive with confrontation or force. It just exists, steady, unfiltered, and unmoved by the expectations around it. And somehow, that's enough to create tension. Because most people aren't reacting to what you say or do. They're reacting to what your presence represents. When you live in alignment with yourself, without constantly adjusting to fit into every space, it challenges the unspoken rules others have been following their entire lives. People build identities based on what works, what gets approval, what avoids rejection. Over time, those choices become habits, and those habits become a version of themselves that feels real, even if it's incomplete. They learn when to agree, when to stay quiet, when to reshape their opinions just enough to stay accepted. It becomes second nature. So when they encounter someone who doesn't operate that way, someone who doesn't seem to be negotiating their identity in every interaction, it creates a kind of friction they don't immediately understand. Your truth highlights the compromises they've made, not in a direct or intentional way, but through contrast. You're not trying to prove anything. You're not forcing your perspective onto anyone, but the difference is visible, and that visibility is enough to make people uncomfortable. Because it raises a question they've been avoiding. What parts of themselves did they give up just to make things easier? Discomfort rarely shows itself honestly. It doesn't walk in and admit that it feels exposed or uncertain. Instead, it looks for something external to blame. It finds ways to reinterpret your behavior in a way that protects their own sense of stability. They might call you distant, difficult, or even arrogant. They might assume you think you're better than them, not because you've said anything to suggest it, but because it's easier than admitting they feel unsettled by your authenticity. There's also a loss of control involved. When someone is predictable, when their actions are shaped by the need for approval, they can be managed. People know how to interact with them, how to influence them, how to keep things within a familiar pattern. But when you're rooted in your own truth, that predictability fades. You're not reacting in expected ways. You're not adjusting just to maintain comfort. And that makes you harder to place within their framework. That uncertainty creates tension. They don't know how to label you, how to categorize you, how to fit you into the roles they're used to assigning. And without a clear label, there's a sense of instability. People rely on those labels to simplify interactions, to feel like they understand the dynamics around them. When you don't fit neatly into those categories, it forces them to think more deeply than they're used to, and not everyone is willing to do that. Your truth also removes the illusion that everyone is doing their best to be themselves. It shows that there's another way to exist, one that doesn't require constant adjustment or quiet compromise. And that realization can be uncomfortable because it suggests that authenticity was always an option, even if it wasn't the easiest one. It shifts responsibility back onto them, and responsibility is something many people try to avoid. Some will be drawn to it, even if they don't fully understand why. There's a certain clarity in being around someone who isn't performing, who isn't filtering every thought through the lens of approval. It feels different, almost unfamiliar, but also real in a way that's hard to ignore. Others will resist it, not openly, but through subtle reactions, distancing themselves or creating narratives that make your behavior easier to dismiss. And all of this happens without you needing to do anything beyond staying aligned with yourself. No confrontation, no explanation, no attempt to change anyone else. Just the quiet presence of someone who isn't negotiating their identity, and that alone is enough to create discomfort in spaces built on quiet compromise. People rarely confront what they can't control directly. It's easier to redirect that discomfort outward, to assign meaning to someone else's behavior, rather than sit with the uncertainty inside themselves. When they can't predict you, can't influence your reactions, can't pull you into the patterns they understand, something shifts. That lack of control doesn't just frustrate them, it unsettles them, and instead of questioning why they feel that way, they begin to project. Projection is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It disguises insecurity as observation, assumption as truth. They'll study your silence and call it arrogance. They'll notice your independence and label it detachment. They'll see your restraint and interpret it as coldness. None of these judgments come from a clear understanding of you. They come from an internal need to make sense of something that doesn't fit within their usual framework. Control gives people a sense of stability. It allows them to navigate interactions without feeling exposed. When they can anticipate how someone will respond, they feel secure. They know what to say, how to act, how to maintain a certain dynamic. But when you don't follow those predictable patterns, when your behavior isn't shaped by their expectations, that sense of stability disappears. And without it, they're left facing their own uncertainty. That's where projection begins to fill the gap. Instead of admitting they don't understand you, they create explanations that protect their perspective. If they feel overlooked, they might assume you're intentionally distant. If they feel uncertain around you, they might decide you're intimidating. These interpretations aren't about your intentions. They're reflections of their internal state, shaped by their own fears and insecurities. There's also a deeper layer to this. When someone can't control you, they can't use the same strategies that work on others. Approval doesn't sway you. Criticism doesn't break you. Attention doesn't define you. That removes a certain level of influence they're used to having. And losing that influence can feel like a threat, especially for those who rely on it to maintain their sense of importance or control within a social space. So they adjust their approach. If they can't control you through direct interaction, they try to control the narrative around you. They create subtle distortions Small shifts in how you're perceived, not always intentionally, not always with awareness, but enough to make your independence seem like a flaw rather than a strength. It becomes a way to regain a sense of balance, to bring you back into a framework they can manage. What makes this dynamic more complex is that it often goes unnoticed by the person projecting. From their perspective, their interpretations feel real. They don't see the connection between their internal discomfort and the assumptions they're making about you. It feels justified, even logical, because it aligns with what they're experiencing internally. And once that narrative forms, it reinforces itself. Every action you take is filtered through it. Every silence becomes confirmation. Every difference becomes proof. Your role in all of this is almost passive, yet impactful. You're not actively creating tension. You're not trying to disrupt anything. You're simply existing in a way that doesn't rely on external validation or predictable reactions. And that alone is enough to expose how much of human interaction is built on control, expectation, and subtle influence. The more grounded you are in yourself, the less accessible you become to those dynamics. Not in a distant or disconnected way, but in a way that doesn't offer easy entry points for manipulation or control. And for some people, that's not just confusing, it's uncomfortable in a way they can't easily explain. So they continue to project, to reinterpret, to reshape your image in ways that make their own feelings easier to carry. Staying real doesn't look like rebellion on the surface. There are no dramatic declarations, no obvious defiance, no need to stand on a stage and announce it. It's quieter than that, almost invisible at first. Just a series of choices that don't align with what's expected, not adjusting your personality depending on who's in the room, not reshaping your opinions just to avoid tension, not trading pieces of yourself for acceptance that was never genuine to begin with. And in a world that quietly rewards conformity, that kind of consistency starts to feel like resistance. Most people don't realize how much they've adapted until they're faced with someone who hasn't. They've learned to smooth out their edges, to filter their thoughts, to present versions of themselves that are easier to accept. It becomes routine, almost automatic. They tell themselves it's necessary, that it keeps things simple, that it avoids conflict. And maybe it does, but it also creates a subtle distance between who they are and how they exist in the world. When you choose to stay real, you close that distance. You operate from a place that isn't constantly negotiating for approval, and that changes how people respond to you. Not always openly, not always in ways that are easy to point out, but the shift is there. Some feel drawn to it, even if they don't fully understand why. There's a certain clarity in being around someone who isn't performing, who isn't calculating every move based on how it will be received. Others feel the opposite. They experience it as disruption, because your way of existing doesn't support the same unspoken agreements they rely on. You're not playing along with the expectations that keep interactions predictable. You're not reinforcing the idea that everyone should quietly adjust to maintain comfort. And without that reinforcement, those expectations start to feel less stable. Rebellion in this sense isn't about opposing others directly. It's about refusing to participate in something that doesn't align with you. It's subtle, but it carries weight, because it removes your contribution to a system that depends on collective agreement. Every time someone chooses authenticity over adaptation, it weakens the illusion that conformity is the only option. That's what makes it powerful, and at the same time, unsettling. It doesn't ask others to change, but it creates the possibility that they could. And that possibility can be uncomfortable for those who have built their lives around fitting in. It raises questions they've avoided, about why they made certain choices, about what they gave up to be accepted, about whether it was ever necessary. There's also a certain independence in staying real that can't be easily influenced. When your sense of self isn't tied to external validation, you're less affected by shifts in opinion. Praise doesn't define you, and criticism doesn't dismantle you. That steadiness can feel unfamiliar to people who are used to adjusting themselves based on feedback. It removes a level of control they didn't realize they depended on. And because it's not loud or confrontational, it's harder to challenge. There's no clear argument to push against, no direct opposition to respond to. It's just a presence that doesn't bend in expected ways. That kind of quiet resistance doesn't create immediate reactions, but it lingers. It changes how people think, even if they don't admit it. It creates a contrast that stays in the background, difficult to ignore over time.